Conrad's novel, The Secret Sharer, takes place in London in the year 1886, and it follows a group of characters who are anarchists. In this video, I'm going to talk about the political movement of anarchism in London at this time in the late 19th century. We know that Conrad derived his information about anarchists from several sources. He had friends who were involved in the anarchist movement. They weren't bombers or anything, but they were familiar with the political philosophy of anarchism. He also, we know, read newspaper accounts of anarchistic activities at the time. And in particular, we know that one of the events depicted in The Secret Agent refers to an actual bombing that took place at the Royal Observatory in Greenwich in the year 1894. So even though the action of the novel is set in 1886, one of the events that's included in it is modeled after an actual event that took place 8 years later in 1894. Conrad developed the novel of The Secret Sharer over a period of several years, in 1906 and 1907. It began as two short stories, The Anarchist and the Informer, that he gradually expanded on. He expanded the stories by adding more material relating to Chief Inspector Heat, and also by expanding the role of Winnie Verloc, focusing more on her emotions and behavior at the end of the novel. We know that as he was developing the novel, he drew on conversations with friends that included Ford Madox Ford, the writer, and also Helen and Olivia Rossetti. And you see here a photograph of Helen Rossetti in the upper left-hand corner. Helen and Olivia were daughters of Dante Gabriel Rossetti, who many of you know as the founder of the Pre-Raphaelite School of Painting. He and his wife, Christina, wanted to support their daughters in all of their activities, even when their daughters proposed to start publishing a paper of the anarchistic movement that they called the Torch of Anarchy. Now, Conrad was kind of dubious about that. They were children, literally, when they did this, so he thought this was not very serious. But in fact, they were very bright and very committed to exploring these philosophical ideas, and the Torch remains as an important document of anarchist thinking from the 1890s. One of the events in The Secret Agent in chapter that takes place between chapter 3 and chapter 4 is a bombing in the park near the Royal Observatory in Greenwich. And this fictional event refers to an actual event that took place on February 15th in 1894. A French agent by the name of Marshal Bourdin went to the park carrying a dynamite bomb that blew up before he intended it to. And he lived for a little while. He was taken to a nearby hospital, but the police found pieces of him and of the bomb scattered around the park. And there are newspaper accounts and police records that document this. There's also a scene in the novel where Conrad talks about the police hunt for the remnants of the bomber in Greenwich Park. So we know that he was familiar with accounts of the time. The bombing in Greenwich took place 3 days after a similar bombing in Paris. And since Bourdin was French, this inflamed fears in London that the violence from the continent might start to spread to Britain. At the time, there was some debate about what Bourdin's intention was. The bomb wasn't big enough to blow up the Royal Observatory, but it could have damaged the building, certainly. Conrad believed that his target was the observatory. And we hear this in Mr. Verloc's discussion with the government representative, Mr. Vladimir, in chapter 2. Vladimir, the character, is thought to be a representative of the Russian government, the government that imprisoned Conrad's father. So obviously he's the villain. Mr. Vladimir argues that the anarchists aren't doing enough, that they need to make more dramatic gestures towards Victorian society. And he suggests that if you really want to attack what he calls bourgeois society, you should hit at science. You should hit at something that symbolizes science. And the Greenwich Observatory, which is connected with both astronomy and time, was the perfect target in his view. Recent scholars have suggested that Bourdain's target may have been this clock that is found at the gate to the Royal Observatory. This is the clock that announces Greenwich Mean Time, which the UK adopted as its national standard in 1880. So by hitting at the clock, you're hitting at this symbol of rationality in science, as well as the British government. Time is also a key element of the novel. The structure moves back and forth in time. So, right after chapter 3, which you read, there's a break of a month before the events in chapter 4, and then the time frame shifts back later at the end of chapter 8. I'm also including an image of the Cutty Sark, the clipper ship, because today it's moored in Greenwich. And if you take a day trip down the Thames River to Greenwich or take the train, you can explore both the Royal Observatory and the Cutty Sark in the same afternoon. And it's really a delightful trip. Anarchist groups like the one that Bourdain belonged to flourished in London from about 1870 to 1900. Most of these anarchists were immigrants from other countries where they had experienced political repression, from Germany, from Russia, or from France after the Paris Commune. Here you see a poster advertising a talk by Prince Kropotkin, who was one of the most famous Russian anarchists of the time, who had escaped imprisonment in Russia, as you can read in this announcement. Anarchists also form clubs to support their communities. The clubs helped new immigrants get oriented to London and provided shelter and soup kitchens to support them. One of these clubs was the Club Autonomy, which was located at 6 Windmill Street in Fitzrovia. In the 1890s, there was a flourishing network of illustrated newspapers, and many of them followed up on the connection between these clubs and the Greenwich bomber. And here you see an illustration from the Leeds Times of men gathered outside the club, and another one from the Illustrated London News that shows the facade of the building, which seems very ordinary looking. You really couldn't tell it apart from any other building on the street. This image in the Illustrated London News appears 9 days after the bombing in Greenwich. The daily papers and the illustrated weeklies seized on the idea that these anarchist clubs were fronts, that they looked very ordinary on the outside, but inside, revolutionaries were planning attacks. You can see examples of how the papers imagined what went on behind these closed doors in this image from the graphic. The image visualizes revolutionaries perhaps being caught as they plotted their crimes in the hallway of the Autonomy Club. The Illustrated London News even carried a picture of the room where Bourdain built his bomb inside the club, reinforcing the idea that monstrous activities took place behind this seemingly innocent facade. The newspaper's fascination with Bourdain's workshop parallels a description of the professor's laboratory in The Secret Agent, and we see it as well in Hitchcock's film, where the bomb maker seems to be a harmless shopkeeper whose materials even get mixed up with a child's toys. There were other parallels between the real Bourdain, the Greenwich bomber, and the characters in Conrad's novel. Both Bourdain and Mr. Verloc acted as police informants, and Bourdain's brother-in-law sets him up in the same way that Verloc does with Stevie. In the 1890s, there was an enormous amount of discussion about anarchists, their clubs, and the Greenwich bombing in the daily papers and these illustrated weeklies. And many scholars have documented how Conrad drew on these accounts in creating The Secret Agent. These media reports, like the page you see here, create links between public spaces like Greenwich Park and the Autonomy Club and hidden spaces such as Bourdain's workshop. The choice and arrangement of images reinforces the idea that sinister things can lurk behind ordinary storefronts. And of course, this is also the spatial dynamic of the Verloc's home. A shop that sells pornography might not be exactly innocent, but one would not guess that anarchists are plotting further inside the building. In Hitchcock's film, the innocent facade is not a shop that sells pornography, but a movie theater, which creates even more possibilities for comparing on-screen and off-screen activities. as we shall see. Thank you.